Hi, everyone. I want to introduce you to Mark MacDonald of Electric Avenue. His company provides smart charging solutions and a cool mobile app to track your charging activity. We are going to talk about all things EV and low balancing. And low balancing ensures multiple vehicles to charge on the same network without overloading the system. So interesting. Coming up next. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks for having me.
That's great. So you're with Electric Avenue. Tell me about you and how it all began.
Yes, absolutely. So Electric Avenue is a company I started, getting close to 3 or 4 years ago now. And I've been an entrepreneur most of my career. I had a brief stint with, at the time, it was the largest tech company in Canada, Nortel Networks. And this was back in the early 2000s. So for anyone who remembers that recession and the
Yeah,
dot-com bubble, I was left jobless and seeking, or at least trying to take my future into my own hands. So I became an entrepreneur shortly after in the very early 2000s. And then I've always been in the sales and marketing side and business development side for electrical manufacturers. And we were looking, electrification, I thought was really important to our vertical. I thought it was important to the business at the time, which was Catalyst Sales and Marketing. And we were looking for a partner to work with in the EV charging space because one, the importance of like a greenhouse gas free environment, but two, more importantly, for many people in our organization was just like making this shift into where business was headed with electrification. So we couldn't find a traditional partner in the electric vehicle charging space that understood our customers, our channel, our path to market. So after quite a bit of frustration and winning some projects with some partners who didn't really align with what we were trying to do, we just said, and I said, forget it, let's start our own company and we'll do it ourselves. And that's where Electric Avenue was born. It was really our existing customer base with Catalyst Sales and Marketing was looking for this solution. We couldn't find one. So we literally built the solution for our customers. And that's what Electric Avenue is now. It's a full product suite and software suite where you can really do anything you could imagine from a recharging an electric vehicle perspective goes.
interesting. Now, when someone is looking or studying EV adoption, the numbers don't lie. When you're looking at data points, they're very important. So, what are your thoughts on the business, of electrification?
Yeah, I think like any business or any predictive model or indices, it's like, okay, it's going to fall somewhere in this spectrum. So
Mhm.
right now, and I get, why there's short sellers and naysayers in the space because it is such a broad sensitivity analysis on what adoption looks like. So right now, I think we're in a bit of a negative news cycle around EVs because maybe some of the bullish targets weren't hit for the 2023. So just going back to your question on the numbers, I think
Mhm.
we're around 10.5 million cars globally in 2022 were zero emission vehicles or battery electric vehicles, BEV as they're known as. This year we're at 18 million. So it is a massive increase by most people's measurements. But the US, for example, I think was hitting a 70% year over year growth and they only hit a 50. So all of a sudden, you'll get some negative market speculation around that, but there's also people with a vested interest, in electrification not moving at the pace they want it to, whether they're in an industry that is counter to it or it threatens that industry, or it's strictly an investment thing. They have short positions in some of these stocks related to electrification. But yeah, the numbers themselves don't lie. We were up, like I said, 18% of all vehicles sold globally were zero emission vehicles or battery electric vehicles last year. And the compounded year over year growth rate is just exponentially going up every year. So where does it fall in that spectrum? Somewhere maybe in the middle of the bull end or the bear end, but it's still moving at a pace that you can't deny. It's coming. It's just a question of how fast it's coming. Those are
Mhm.
strictly the numbers, like the free market numbers. Then you also have regulatory capture that's pushing it too, because you have governments across the world. If you look at the Kyoto Accord agreement, everyone who has signed on to the Paris Climate Deal, the Kyoto Accord, has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's target thresholds within there. So if you just take the Canadian government or the US government, essentially we've committed that by 2035 in
Yeah.
the light duty vehicle sector, we will not sell anything but a
Yeah,
zero emission vehicle.
all new vehicles will be EV. So what are your thoughts on that for Canada?
Well, actually, not necessarily EV. The government's kind of covering their both ends right now. It states zero emission. So there's still some people pushing for hydrogen fuel
Okay.
cell or hydrogen combustion. So those also qualify
Hmm.
under the government mandate. My thoughts are unbiased because I'm in this industry. Like, I think regulation can definitely help, but I also think the market, it has to make sense for the market, because you can't like hit people with a stick to get mass adoption. There's carrots, there's sticks. Right now, our government is choosing carrots in the sense that, hey, we'll incent you to buy the vehicle. So I think depending on some variables, $5,000 federal rebate if you purchase a zero emission vehicle right now in Canada. Some provinces are kicking it up, like Quebec. I think it's almost $12,000
Mhm.
total subsidy. So those are the carrots I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then the opposite side of the spectrum is like the stick saying, well, you just can't buy this after 2035. My problem with the regulatory approach is it's hard to move the entire market doing it that way. So I think if we're really going to hit our adoption targets, the technology just also has to be phenomenal and like better than its current counterparts. So if you look at
And the
something like that
infrastructure.
new Tesla Model S, I'm not advocating for Tesla in any way, but if you just look at that Tesla Model S or some of the other vehicles that are now coming to market, strictly from like a straight line performance standpoint, that Tesla Model S at $150,000 Canadian is the fastest production vehicle ever built, or it was for a time.
Mhm.
150,000. Its closest rival as an internal combustion engine is like the Bugatti Chiron. It's a $4.5 million vehicle. So I think if we keep building better vehicles, if the market keeps putting better vehicles to market, if we get the infrastructure, that's the biggest impediment right now,
Mhm.
is infrastructure. When people have a bad experience with electric, it's typically around refueling them. And I think, Maria, when you and I talk, you drive an electric, so you know this story. But refueling them is one of, or recharging them is one of the big issues. So I think getting the infrastructure out there so consumers don't have that bad experience and they don't pass that bad experience on is like critically important. And that's the other place our government is spending money right now, is on infrastructure, and the US government as well. We do it under the ZVIP program, the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. In the US, they have a few. Their big one is NEVI, which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So I think if we can figure those two things out, building better vehicles, better battery technology, and then having the infrastructure to support the adoption at the rate it's going, which we just talked about earlier, then I think you'll get mass adoption. It's no more like, oh, they're worse for the environment, they're better for the environment, like all these things. If they're just better technologies and we're fueling them from clean energy sources, then the science and the facts are there to support, like, hey, no, this does reduce the carbon footprint over the life of this vehicle.
Hmm. Electric Avenue's tagline is always be charging. So can you explain this a little bit further? The always be charging.
Yes, yeah. I forget where I heard it the first time, but I fell in love with it. Mostly because if anyone, again, I'm going to date myself. I already told you about my first recession in the early 2000s. But
Right.
if anyone remembers a movie with Alec Baldwin, it was called Glengarry Glen Ross. I don't think it lands today in our current social environment, but he had a tagline, always be closing. But always be charging is fun because it's a playoff. Always be closing related to sales,
Oh,
but always be
okay.
charging. Always be charging is also extremely like relevant for people who aren't used to battery electric vehicles, because fundamentally the way you refuel or recharge, I'll use those terms interchangeably, is different than an internal combustion engine. When we have, for the last 100+ years, when we've driven around internal combustion engines, we would fill it to full, we would wait till empty, and then we would stop for 5 minutes at a gas station, which has the most incredible distribution network because it's had over 100 years to build out that distribution network. So that's how you would fill up a gas vehicle, an internal combustion engine. Wait till empty, fill it back up to full, maybe drive a week, maybe drive 2 weeks, whatever your driving habits are, and you would refill it. That's not a great use case for battery electric vehicles, and for a few reasons. One is like battery maintenance. So to constantly let the battery go down to 0 and bring it back to 100, it actually kills, it degrades the life expectancy of that battery and also the range that that battery can provide. So the concept of always be charging is like a play off how conceptually we need to change our refueling, recharging habits with electrics. It's better to play this game of constant top up. So I get up in the morning, I unplug my vehicle, I drive to work, I drive to the grocery store, I take my kids to the rink or the gym, whatever it may be, and I come back. They call it the 3 seconds a day. I plug in at night, it takes me 3 seconds. I unplug 3 seconds in the morning. That is significantly better for battery maintenance. And that's why so much, going back to what I mentioned earlier about infrastructure, how infrastructure is going to change consumer perception. Because the more infrastructure we have everywhere, the easier this ABC habit becomes. So I have a charger at my workplace. I have a charger at home. I have a charger at the IKEA, at the mall, at the movie theater, at the golf course. My fleet has charging on site. My home has a charger. My apartment building has a charger. And then I'm constantly topping up. One, which is better for the battery, but two, it's also a more cost-effective and easier way for the grid to manage EV charging loads, because now I only need these low-cost, what are called level 2 chargers. So level 2 essentially takes the same amount of power as your stove, so it actually can use the same plug as your stove. Those are really easy to deploy, and they're also not that expensive. Even a commercial one that does billing and all these really cool features of load management, you're still only looking at $2,500 for one of these, as opposed to those big fast chargers, which get you in between your destinations, which could cost $150,000, $200,000. So there's a whole lot of reasons, always be charging is a better philosophy when building out infrastructure for battery electric vehicles.
Something you had mentioned earlier, and I never really occurred to me, was when electric vehicles are in transit. Let's say they're in between dealerships, or they're just moving from point A to point B on a transit truck or a train or what have you. And those need to be charged. Like they need to, they need to be topped up. So, what's involved and what does this look like, this in between destinations?
Yes. Yeah, if you look at that, that's a good one. If you look at the entire manufacturing to delivery of that product, just that charging infrastructure alone is like its own marketplace, because you're absolutely right. And the concept is no different. We can draw the comparison on that one to an internal combustion engine. If we're here in Halifax. Halifax is a port city on the Atlantic Ocean. We bring in the majority of European vehicles into Canada through our auto port here in Halifax. And just like an internal combustion engine, it would not leave the Audi or Mercedes manufacturing line in Germany with a full tank of gas, right? Because now you've got 1,000 vehicles with a full tank of gas. It's an explosive source on a shipping vessel. And the same is true with batteries. You wouldn't ship that vehicle with 100% charge because of the stored energy in the battery and the fire hazard that would create. So the comparison is identical. And then, the amount of charging infrastructure. And one of our favorite projects, or my favorite projects we've worked on as a manufacturer of EV chargers and software, is CP Rail, so Canadian Pacific Rail. So we provided fast chargers for all their facilities. So let's take that use case. Mercedes new all electric vehicle, ships from Germany, lands at the auto port here, right? It will need a top up. So we've got infrastructure there at the auto port, gets on the rail line. CP Rail has fast chargers, not only for the transit of vehicles, but also for their internal fleet. CP has started converting their fleet vehicles that work their rail lines to electrics. The Ford Lightning's a prime example of a work vehicle that electrified is a great solution and probably has a really good ROI depending on your use case. So now they've got EV charging infrastructure there. And then when they finally get to the destination, which is the dealership, we've worked with dealers across Canada, Ford, GM, Chev, Honda, Acura, you name it. We've provided fast charging and level 2 charging infrastructure for those dealers, because then once they finally do arrive to Ford dealers want a great delivery experience. So they're going to top those vehicles up to 100% before that end user, the consumer, picks up their vehicle. And then, then we're into the infrastructure we talked about earlier. Now, hopefully there's a charger at their home. Hopefully there's a charger at their work. And that's the type of infrastructure we're talking, really to solve this problem that we're having around EV charging infrastructure.
Can you describe the concept around load balancing for multi-unit buildings, like multiple chargers plugged into the same network.
Yes. Yeah, that's an important one. It's something like I'll hear frequently in conversation or, just reading on the subject. People are always worried about the grid. Like,
Right.
okay, cool. You want everyone in North America or globally to drive a battery electric vehicle, but our grid can't support it. That's the most common thing that I'll hear or you may hear. And the numbers don't really support that, but the reality is a bit different. I'll speak to it in this way. Right now, if we want to electrify 100% of the light duty vehicles in North America, we only need about 15% more energy on the grid. So if you turn on every single production facility and every single peaker plant, so every generating station and every what we call peaker plant or peak demand response, if you just maxed out energy production right now in North America to electrify the transportation system, we only need about 15% more energy. The problem is the reality of the math, the math doesn't line up with the reality, which is people want to charge when they want to charge. So right now, because the grid was built for like Christmas Day and, Thanksgiving, everyone's home, everyone's cooking, the heat's on, the lights are on, like that's how much power we have on the grid. But if you can convince people to change their charging habits or use charging habits that match unused headroom on the grid, which is typically at night, right? People are doing less things, so the grid demand is lower at night. So if we can, one, convince people to charge at night or put what we call DERMS programs in place, distributed energy resource management systems, where utilities can actually control EVs and EV charging loads on the grid, then all of a sudden that 15% additional power becomes a viable goal, because now we're talking about things like renewable energy, solar, wind. There's a lot of ways to get to that 15%. So one, controlling charging habits gets us there. And the other thing that you said that you and I talked about is load management. So actually managing these loads within the building, because the average Canadian only drives about 50 or 60 kilometers a day. On a level 2 charger, like I talked about with the stove,
Right.
plug, that much energy, that's only about 2 to 3 hours of charge time per night. So if I come home, let's take an apartment building, which is a prime example, because 40% of Canadians don't own their home. 31% of Canadians live in a multi-unit residential building. So 3 units are up. Let's say I come home to my apartment building and I get home at 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night. I don't leave the next day to 7, 8, 9 o'clock the next day. So I've got a 12-hour window where my vehicle's parked and plugged in.
Right.
If I was going to dedicate one breaker, one circuit, one outlet for that charger, the load calculation on the building, so the amount of energy you'd have to bring in that building to support that 1-to-1 ratio is astronomical. But now all of a sudden, if I can put 4, 5, or 6 chargers all on the same circuit, but through software control them, so ultimately if the homeowner comes home at that 5, 6, 7 and they wake up at 7, 8, 9 and their vehicle's charged back to 100%, that's the experience they care about. They don't care that maybe it took it 4 or 5 or 6 times longer to get there. So that's the idea of load balancing, and that's some of the nuances around getting the grid to the point where it needs to be. Ultimately, an electrified transportation system creates a more robust grid. When you start talking about things like bi-directional charging, where, okay, not only can I draw energy into my battery from the grid, but during grid events, demand events, what Halifax is like with our storms, during power outages, if I could also return that energy from my battery back to my home, back to the grid, it actually creates a more robust grid and a better system and experience for everybody.
Yeah, it would. Bi-direction is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
From what I hear, it's not available yet, right? It's just not.
The standard is there. There's a few manufacturers like Ford with that Lightning who advertise it. Unfortunately, the reality of actually, doing it, it's expensive. It's cost prohibitive right now. I think I got a quote. We have a Ford Lightning in our fleet, and I think I got a quote to do their whole bi-directional system. And it was going to be like a $20,000 all-in cost for that feature. So like anything, economies of scale. The standards there, it's built under the ISO 15118 standard. The standard for bi-directional there, there's more manufacturers announcing they're going to offer it. And then eventually the cost of all that electrical infrastructure will come down. So it's there, it's just not there for those reasons.
So if I was a multi-unit owner, of a building, and I was considering putting in some charging units, what are some of the myths or some of the misconceptions that you might come across?
I think one of the big ones, or one of the big concerns, I don't know about misconception, is just like a way to recoup the cost, because the developers we work with are concerned about putting charging infrastructure in, because once you get above what we would deem a low rise, so let's say 5 stories, once you're below a 5-story apartment building, those are typically easier to deploy EV charging infrastructure in, because you have like the individual meters for each unit or each suite down in the parking garage. So
Mhm.
there's systems where you can tap in to the tenant or the condo owner's meter, and all that charging energy can just go right on their, let's say, Nova Scotia Power bill or Power bill. So those are kind of easy. Where it becomes hard, and one of the myths that I run into with developers, once you get into high rises, so there's no longer meters in the parking garages. They put them up on the individual floors to lower the cost of the electrical infrastructure. Now they're trying to figure out, well, hey, I only have what we deem a house meter. So I, the developer, own that meter with my power, with my utility, and I need to weigh, I'm buying that energy at 12, 13, 15, 20, depending what market you're in, 30 cents a kilowatt hour. How do I bill my tenants for that energy? So that's one myth, like the ability to do that and recoup those costs. So that's where like smart or commercial charging infrastructure starts to make sense in those applications, where you can actually, there's metering systems in the chargers. So you can buy the energy from your utility at 15, 20, 30 cents kilowatt hour, and you can resell that to your tenant. And now all of a sudden you've got an ROI. One, you've got an amenity, and maybe you have an amenity in that space to differentiate yourself as a developer. But then two, you've got an ROI or a payback scheme for that CapEx and of course the OpEx to maintain that hardware. So that's a big one. People don't think it can be done. And then two, the other one you and I touched on is they just don't think the service will support it, the electrical service in their building. So, they just wash their hands of it because it's too complicated. But that's where things like load balancing come into play, which we just touched on, where you
Yeah.
put more chargers on the existing circuitry that you have in the building, or going a level up. We also have a monitoring system. There's a monitoring system where you can monitor the power coming into the building, and you can correlate that to the amount of load going into the EV charging. So you can ensure you're always using that unused electrical headroom, if you will, in the building, and apply that to vehicles. So there's a whole lot of cool schemes most people aren't even aware of, where they can add much more EV charging infrastructure, not only to apartment buildings, commercial fleet applications, without getting into really costly service or electrical upgrades.
What solution-based projects is Electric Avenue working on? What does the next year look like for you guys?
Our pipeline, it's going to be a fun year, no question. So we entered the US last quarter. We just shipped our first few orders into the US. So the US market is a whole nother, world for us that's new, and the projects that are going to come out of that market are exciting. But here, we still love working with the development community. We have a project approved through some federal funding right now for over 600 level 2 residential chargers. So that's one project, one developer has an incredible commitment to sustainability and shifting his buildings to net zero buildings. So really excited about that one. And then we've got projects with hospital out on the West Coast that looks really fun, getting into that space because we were so focused on the multi-unit world for so long. And then we just launched our first hardware that we designed like start to finish. We actually own the IP on. So it's exciting. It's mostly designed around MIRVs and fleets, but we're excited to see the applications that fits into in the entire North American market.
Sounds like a great year ahead for you guys. I wish you guys
Very
all the
excited.
best. Yeah. Thanks, Mark, for joining me today. Appreciate you having on the podcast, and keep me posted on what happens next.
I will, absolutely. Thanks, Maria.
That was Mark MacDonald of Electric Avenue. Do you have any questions or comments about this episode or even previous ones? If so, make a comment below or send an email to podcast@sociablemedia.co. Special shout out to Smart Energy Event, who were sponsors of this podcast. And thanks to you for watching or listening today. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. We'll see you next time.